The maid wasn't supposed to touch the Alpha King. She did anyway. And for one terrifying heartbeat, the entire palace forgot how to breathe. The royal courtyard buzzed with activity beneath a pale winter sky. Servants hurried between wagons loaded with supplies. Royal guards polished their armor until it gleamed like silver. Stable hands soothed restless horses, harnessed to the grandest carriage in the kingdom. A masterpiece of black oak trimmed with polished steel, prepared to carry Alpha King Alistair Ravencrest to the Winter Alliance summit. Every detail had been inspected, every route planned, every danger anticipated. Or so everyone believed. Standing at the palace steps, Alistair accepted a scroll from his chief minister without taking his eyes off the waiting carriage. "If we leave now," the minister said, "we'll reach Ravencliff before the evening snow." Alistair nodded. "Let's not keep the northern delegates waiting." The captain of the royal guard barked an order. "Open the gates." The heavy iron doors groaned apart. Trumpets sounded. The horses stamped impatiently. The king descended the palace steps with calm, practiced confidence. The crowd bowed as he passed. Among them stood Clara Ashfield, a laundry maid no one noticed. Her plain gray dress blended into the sea of servants. Her hands trembled so violently she could barely hold the basket of freshly mended uniforms she carried. No, not again. She stared at the royal carriage, at the polished wheels, at the leather brake ropes, at the cliff road waiting miles ahead. The memories crashed into her with brutal clarity. Wood splintering, horses screaming, the carriage tumbling into empty air, fire, blood, the king's lifeless hand hanging through the shattered door. Then the palace burning, soldiers fighting each other in the streets. The kingdom collapsing into war. She had watched it all happen. She had died, believing nothing could be changed. Yet somehow, she had awakened months earlier, on the first morning she entered palace service, given one impossible chance to begin again. Until now, she had only changed small things. A servant spared from falling down a staircase. A child pulled away from a runaway cart. Tiny moments no one noticed. But this was the moment that decided everything. The king reached the carriage. One foot rose toward the polished step. If he climbed inside, history would repeat itself. Clara dropped her basket. Uniforms scattered across the stone courtyard. Ignoring the horrified cries behind her, she ran. "Stop her!" someone shouted. She reached the king just as his hand touched the carriage door. Without thinking, she grabbed his sleeve. The courtyard exploded into chaos. The captain's sword flashed from its scabbard. "Release His Majesty!" Guards surrounded her instantly. Clara didn't even look at them. She looked only at Alistair. Her face had gone completely white. "Please." Her voice shook so badly she almost couldn't speak. "Don't get into that carriage." The king frowned. Around them, every conversation died. The winter wind seemed to hold its breath. "Why?" Alistair asked quietly. Clara swallowed hard, because she remembered exactly how he died. "The left rear wheel will break when you reach Ravencliff." She pointed toward the carriage with trembling fingers. "But that isn't what will kill you." The captain stared at her. "What are you talking about?" Tears filled Clara's eyes. "The wheel is only the trap." She took one unsteady breath. "Someone has already cut the brake ropes." Silence crashed over the courtyard. Alistair slowly turned toward his chief engineer. "Inspect the carriage." The engineer hesitated. "Your Majesty, we all ready. Now." Minutes later, a horrified cry echoed from beneath the carriage. The royal courtyard remained frozen in stunned silence. Then the chief engineer crawled out from beneath the carriage. His face had lost all color. In his shaking hands hung a length of leather rope. or what remained of it. The brake line has been cut. He swallowed hard, almost completely. Several strands still clung together, thin enough to escape notice during an ordinary inspection. One hard pull on Ravencliff's steep descent, and they would have snapped. The captain of the Royal Guard snatched the rope from his hands. Searched the entire carriage. Within moments, guards dismantled the wheels, examined the axles, and inspected every bolt. Another engineer shouted from the rear, "The left wheel has been weakened." He held up a cracked wooden spoke. It was split from the inside. It would have broken under the king's weight once the road turned rocky. A cold murmur spread through the courtyard. It wasn't an accident. It had been planned with terrifying precision. A broken wheel, failed brakes, a narrow mountain pass. No witnesses left alive. Alistair stared at the ruined carriage. Someone hadn't merely wanted to kill him. They wanted the kingdom to believe fate had done it. "Seal the palace," he ordered. "No one leaves." The captain immediately barked commands. "Close every gate. Question every stable hand. Search the workshops." Guards rushed in every direction. Ministers argued over possible suspects. Servants huddled together in frightened whispers. Amid the chaos, Clara stood exactly where she had been, her hands clasped tightly before her. She wished she could disappear. Instead, she felt the king's gaze settle on her. "You." His voice was calm. "What is your name?" She bowed deeply. "Clara Ashfield, Your Majesty." "How did you know?" Every eye turned toward her. She had prepared this answer countless times. "I overheard 2 stable hands talking last night." The captain frowned. "Which stable hands?" "I didn't recognize them." "Where?" "Near the east stables." The explanation sounded reasonable. Most people accepted it immediately. Most people. Alistair did not. He had spent years reading liars across negotiating tables. Clara wasn't lying. She was hiding something. There was a difference. Before he could ask another question, a young guard hurried into the courtyard. "Captain, we found no damaged tools, no suspicious servants. It's as though whoever sabotaged the carriage vanished." The captain cursed under his breath. Alistair looked once more at Clara. She lowered her eyes, avoiding his gaze. Not out of guilt, out of fear. He recognized that fear. It wasn't the fear of punishment. It was the fear of knowing something no one else should. Late that evening, after the palace finally settled into uneasy silence, Alistair summoned his captain. Captain Rowan. The veteran soldier stepped forward. "Your Majesty, I have another assignment." Rowan waited. "I want you to watch the maid." His eyebrows lifted slightly. "You suspect her?" "No." Alistair looked toward the dark courtyard, where the shattered carriage still stood beneath torchlight. "I suspect she knows far more than she's willing to say." The next morning, Rowan began quietly following Clara through the palace. For hours, nothing unusual happened. She folded linens, delivered clean uniforms, helped an elderly cook carry flour to the kitchens. Then, just before noon, Clara suddenly stopped walking. She turned toward the royal stables. Her expression changed instantly. Without warning, she dropped everything and ran. Rowan sprinted after her. By the time he reached the stable yard, Clara had already thrown herself between a frightened warhorse and a little stable boy chasing a loose bucket. The horse reared violently. Its iron-shod hooves crashed down exactly where the child had been standing only a heartbeat before. The boy lived. Because somehow, Clara had known. Captain Rowan had spent 20 years protecting the royal family. He trusted evidence. He trusted instincts. He did not trust coincidences. Yet Clara Ashfield was becoming impossible to explain. The frightened warhorse should have crushed the stable boy. Instead, Clara reached him seconds before disaster struck. The child escaped with nothing more than a scraped knee. Rowan said nothing. He simply watched. 3 days later, another accident nearly happened. The palace kitchens bustled with preparations for a banquet honoring foreign ambassadors. Servants hurried between ovens, carrying steaming pots and heavy trays. Clara entered with fresh linens for the cooks. She stopped so abruptly that another maid bumped into her. "No," Clara whispered. The head cook frowned. "What is it?" Instead of answering, Clara hurried across the kitchen and grabbed a young servant by the arm. "Step back." The girl blinked. "But Now." Startled by Clara's urgency, the servant obeyed. A heartbeat later, the thick rope suspending a massive iron cauldron snapped. The boiling stew crashed onto the stone floor. Steam exploded through the kitchen. Everyone froze. Had the servant remained where she stood, she would have been beneath it. The head cook slowly turned toward Clara. "How did you know?" Clara lowered her eyes. "I heard the rope creaking." No one questioned her. Everyone had heard old ropes creak before. Only Rowan noticed something troubling. The rope hadn't made a sound until after Clara moved. The following week, palace gardeners prepared the western greenhouse for early winter flowers. Clara arrived, carrying fresh towels for the workers. She stared at the glass roof overhead, then dropped the basket. "Everyone out." The gardeners looked at her in confusion. "What?" "Leave." Her voice cracked with panic. The urgency in her expression sent workers rushing toward the doors. The last gardener had barely stepped outside when the ancient roof collapsed. Glass and timber shattered across the empty floor. Silence followed. Then grateful voices filled the air. "You saved us." Clara didn't wait for thanks. She quietly picked up her basket and walked away before anyone could stop her. That evening, Rowan reported everything to the king. Alistair listened without interrupting. The horse, the kitchen, the greenhouse. Rowan folded his arms. Every explanation sounds reasonable, but they're all too perfect. Alistair stared into the fireplace. She's preventing disasters before anyone else even notices them. Rowan nodded. I've searched her background. Nothing unusual. She's 22, daughter of a miller. No criminal record, no connections to noble houses, no reason to know what she knows. The king remained silent. At last he stood. "Tomorrow," he fastened his cloak. "I'll watch her myself." The next afternoon, Alistair quietly followed Clara through the palace corridors. She worked without complaint. She smiled politely at servants, helped an elderly maid carry heavy laundry. Nothing about her seemed extraordinary. Until sunset. As Clara crossed the palace gardens, she suddenly stopped beside the old fountain. Her shoulders began to shake. She looked around carefully, believing herself alone. Then she sank onto a stone bench. She covered her face with both hands and cried. Not the tears of someone seeking sympathy. The quiet, exhausted tears of someone carrying a burden far too heavy to bear. Hidden beneath the shadow of an archway, Alistair watched in silence. For the first time, he stopped wondering whether Clara was dangerous. Instead, he wondered what terrible secret had taught an ordinary maid to fear tomorrow more than today. He decided he would ask her, alone. The palace laundry was quiet after sunset. Most servants had already retired to their quarters. Only the steady rhythm of a needle passing through cloth broke the silence. Clara sat alone beneath a lantern, repairing torn guard uniforms. It kept her hands busy. When her hands were busy, her memories were quieter. The door opened. She looked up. Alpha King Alistair Ravencrest stepped inside alone. No guards, no ministers. He closed the door behind him. "I hope I'm not interrupting." Clara quickly rose to her feet and bowed. "Your Majesty." You don't have to be afraid. She almost laughed. Afraid? She had lived through the end of the world. This room held nothing she feared. Alistair pulled out a wooden chair and sat across from her. For a long moment, neither of them spoke. Finally, he asked the question she had dreaded since the day she grabbed his sleeve. How did you know about the carriage? Clara stared at the half-finished uniform in her lap. I told everyone I overheard stable hands. I know. His voice remained calm. But that wasn't the truth. Silence stretched between them. I watched you save a stable boy, he continued gently. You prevented the kitchen accident. You emptied the greenhouse before it collapsed. He leaned forward slightly. You always arrive just before disaster. Clara's fingers tightened around the needle. I can't explain it. Try. Tears blurred her vision. If I tell you, you'll think I've gone mad. I'll decide that afterward. Something in his voice made her believe him. She slowly set the uniform aside, then whispered, 6 months ago, you died. The words hung between them. The carriage went over Raven Cliff. No one survived. She swallowed hard. The kingdom didn't lose only its king. It lost itself. Her voice trembled as the memories returned. Nobles accused one another of murder. The royal army split apart. Entire villages burned. The palace became a battlefield. She closed her eyes. I tried to help the wounded. I hid children in the cellar. I watched people I knew die. A tear slipped down her cheek. The fire reached the laundry wing on the 3rd night. I never made it out. The room was silent except for the crackling lantern. When I opened my eyes, she looked at him. I was back on my first day working here. The palace was whole. You were alive. I thought it was a dream, but then everything started happening exactly as I remembered. She took a shaky breath. So I changed what I could. A servant on the stairs. A child in the market. A horse. The carriage. I kept hoping. Her voice broke. If I saved enough people, maybe I could stop the rest. Alistair didn't interrupt. He simply listened. When she finally fell silent, she whispered, I'm sorry. His brow furrowed. For what? For touching you. For changing things. For telling you something impossible. She expected disbelief, laughter, perhaps even an order to have the palace physician examine her mind. Instead, Alistair rose slowly, walked to the window, looked out across the moonlit courtyard where the broken carriage still stood. After a long silence, he turned back to her. The brake ropes were cut. She nodded. The wheel was sabotaged. Another nod. You couldn't have known that. No. He studied her tear-filled eyes, then spoke 4 words that stole the breath from her lungs. Tell me everything. For the first time since waking in her second life, Clara wasn't carrying the future alone. The first person Alistair told was no one. Not his ministers, not the royal council, not even Captain Rowan. If Clara's story was true, then every careless word could change the future, or warn the people responsible for it. For 3 nights, they met in the old palace library after everyone else had retired. Clara spread sheets of parchment across a long oak table. She drew maps from memory, marked villages, roads, names, dates. I don't remember everything, she admitted. Some events happened at the same time. You remember enough, Alistair replied. She pointed to a village in the eastern valley. 2 months from now, the river floods after the spring thaw. 3 bridges collapse. Hundreds lose their homes. Alistair made a note. What causes it? The old dam upstream gives way. He immediately wrote another order. Inspect the dam. Strengthen the foundations. Evacuate nearby farms if necessary. Clara moved her finger farther south. A grain warehouse catches fire in early summer. The kingdom loses nearly a third of its winter reserves. Famine follows. Alistair didn't hesitate. Double the inspections. Move half the grain to secondary storehouses. She looked at him. You believe me? He smiled faintly. I believe evidence. So far, you've been right every time. A week later, Captain Rowan entered the king's study, carrying another report. The eastern dam collapsed this morning. Clara's face paled. Alistair looked up, and the reinforcements held. Only the outer wall gave way. No villages were flooded. No lives were lost. For the first time since her impossible journey began, Clara simply stared. That wasn't how it had happened before. In her memories, the floodwaters had swept away dozens of homes. Children had been stranded on rooftops. Entire families had disappeared. Now, none of it had happened. History had changed. She whispered, almost to herself. It worked. Alistair noticed the tears gathering in her eyes. What's wrong? I don't know what's supposed to happen anymore. She laughed softly through those tears. For months, I lived by remembering the future. She looked at the report again. But now, the future is different. Alistair folded the parchment. Good. She blinked. He continued. The purpose was never to recreate the future. It was to build a better one. Days turned into weeks. The changes multiplied. A corrupt tax collector was arrested before stealing from poor villages. An assassination attempt against a foreign ambassador failed because Rowan doubled the palace guard. A shipment of medicine reached the northern territories before disease could spread. Every success erased another painful memory from Clara's first life. One evening, as they reviewed reports in the library, she frowned at her notes. This isn't right. Alistair looked up. What isn't? In the first future, she searched the pages. The harvest festival ended with a warehouse fire. But it already happened, and nothing burned. She looked genuinely bewildered. I don't remember this version. Alistair leaned back in his chair. Perhaps that's the best news we've received. She smiled uncertainly. Why? Because it means the future is no longer leading us. He closed the final report. We're writing it ourselves. For the first time since waking in her second life, Clara allowed herself to believe something she had never dared imagine. Maybe the terrible future she remembered wasn't waiting for them anymore. Maybe it had finally begun to disappear. Summer settled over the kingdom. Golden wheat rippled across the valleys. Markets overflowed with grain instead of empty baskets. Travelers crossed repaired bridges that, in another life, had been washed away by floodwaters. The kingdom no longer resembled the one Clara remembered. Each morning, new reports arrived. A village that should have burned was thriving. A noble once known for corruption had been arrested before committing his greatest crimes. Children who had died during the famine now played happily in village squares. Each victory filled Clara with quiet relief. Yet one memory refused to fade. She saw it every night. Fire, smoke, the palace collapsing beneath a crimson sky. One evening, Alistair found her standing alone on the western balcony. She was watching the sunset, but her eyes seemed fixed on something far beyond the horizon. You've been avoiding sleep again. She smiled weakly. I didn't realize it was obvious. It is to someone who watches you. She lowered her gaze. There are still things I haven't told you. He waited. In the first future, she struggled to continue. The palace didn't burn by accident. Alistair's expression grew serious. I know. The conspirators set it ablaze after your death. She nodded. But that's not what I kept hidden. Silence settled between them. Finally she whispered, I didn't escape. He looked at her. I stayed. She took a shaky breath. There were servants trapped inside. Children too. I helped them reach the eastern gate. Her voice trembled. The roof collapsed before I could follow. The memory stole the air from her lungs. I died in the laundry corridor. Alistair closed the distance between them. You died saving people. I died because I couldn't leave them. Tears slipped down her cheeks. I keep wondering, what if history finds another way? What if no matter how much we change, I still end up dying there? Without thinking, Alistair gently took her hands. His touch was warm, steady. No. She looked up. You can't know that. Well, I do. How? Because that future depended on one thing, my death. He held her gaze. I'm still here, and I intend to remain here for a very long time. She gave a fragile smile. You sound very confident. I have an excellent advisor. She laughed despite herself. The sound eased something inside him. For months, Clara had carried the burden of tomorrow alone. She no longer had to. The following morning, Alistair summoned the Royal Council. Without revealing Clara's secret, he announced sweeping reforms. Every palace corridor would receive new emergency exits. Fire brigades would be established in every major city. Storehouses would be rebuilt using stone instead of timber. Emergency drills became mandatory throughout the kingdom. Some nobles questioned the expense. Alistair answered simply, I won't wait for tragedy before preparing for it. Months passed. Not a single fire spread beyond its first spark. The palace became the safest building in the kingdom. One crisp autumn evening, Clara stood beside the old carriage still preserved in the courtyard. She touched the weathered wood. It should have killed you. Alistair joined her, but it didn't. She smiled. No. He looked toward the palace, alive with music and laughter. You once carried the future by yourself. He offered her his hand. You never will again. For the first time since fate had given her a second chance, Clara truly believed him. Exactly 1 year after the day Clara stopped the royal carriage, the palace courtyard filled once again. Snow drifted gently from a pale winter sky. The same stone path where frightened guards had once surrounded a trembling maid was now lined with nobles, soldiers, merchants, and ordinary villagers invited from every corner of the kingdom. No one knew why the king had summoned them. At the center of the courtyard stood the broken carriage. It had been carefully restored, not to be used again, but to preserve the scars left by the sabotage. The cracked wheel remained untouched. The frayed brake rope rested across the driver's seat. A reminder, not of death, but of the life that followed. Clara waited near the palace steps, still wearing the simple blue dress of a royal servant. She had no idea why Alistair had asked her to be there. The murmuring crowd fell silent as the Alpha King stepped forward. He wore his ceremonial black cloak, but there was nothing formal about the warmth in his eyes. He looked first at the carriage, then at Clara. "A year ago," he began, "everyone believed this carriage represented duty." He rested one hand on the damaged wheel. "I know differently. It represents a choice." The crowd listened in complete silence. A young maid ignored every rule that governed this palace. Soft laughter rippled through the gathering. She touched her king. More smiles appeared. She interrupted a royal departure. The captain of the guard chuckled, and she very nearly gave Captain Rowan a heart attack. The old captain bowed dramatically. "I still haven't forgiven her, Your Majesty." The crowd laughed. Even Clara smiled through nervous tears. Alistair's expression softened. She had every reason to remain silent. No title, no power, no certainty that anyone would believe her. He turned toward Clara, but she spoke anyway. "Because of her courage, my life was spared. Our kingdom was spared." He slowly descended the palace steps until he stood before her. Every noble watched in stunned silence. Every servant held their breath. Alistair reached into a velvet box, carried by the High Elder. Inside rested a silver Luna bracelet, engraved with wolves, running beneath a full moon. "I once believed crowns made rulers." He looked into Clara's eyes. "You taught me something better. The people who change history are often the ones history almost overlooks." His voice became quieter. "You saved me. Then you stayed. You challenged me. You helped me become the king this kingdom deserved." He held out the bracelet. "Clara Ashfield, I don't ask because I owe you a debt. I ask because I cannot imagine building tomorrow without you beside me." Tears spilled freely down Clara's cheeks. 1 year earlier, she had stood in this same courtyard believing she would always be invisible. Now, an entire kingdom waited for her answer. She held out her trembling hand. Yes. Alistair fastened the Luna bracelet around her wrist. At that exact moment, wolves across the palace grounds lifted their heads and howled into the falling snow. The sound echoed across the capital. The royal guards drew their swords in salute. The servants applauded louder than anyone, because one of their own had become queen, not through noble birth, not through ambition, but through extraordinary courage. And for the first time since waking in a second life, Clara allowed herself to believe this happiness truly belonged to her. The first decree Queen Clara signed surprised the entire royal council. It wasn't about taxes, or treaties, or expanding the royal palace. It was only one sentence. Every voice deserves to be heard, regardless of rank. Several elderly nobles exchanged puzzled glances. One councilman finally asked, "Your Majesty, what does that mean in practice?" Clara smiled. "It means that if a stable boy notices a cracked bridge, he will be listened to. If a kitchen maid smells smoke where there shouldn't be any, she will be believed. If a servant warns of danger, no one will silence them, simply because they wear a plain uniform." Alistair watched quietly from beside the throne. He remembered another morning. A frightened laundry maid had nearly been arrested for daring to grab his sleeve. He had almost climbed into a doomed carriage, because everyone believed rank mattered more than truth. Never again. Within months, the kingdom changed. Every royal estate placed anonymous report boxes where servants could safely report dangers or corruption. Local councils were required to investigate every warning, no matter who delivered it. Road inspectors checked bridges before every winter. Royal carriages underwent independent inspections before long journeys. Fire brigades trained in every major town. The changes seemed ordinary, until the results became impossible to ignore. Accidents declined. Corruption was uncovered early. Villages recovered faster after storms. People began saying the kingdom had become strangely lucky. Only Alistair and Clara knew it wasn't luck. It was listening. One spring afternoon, the king and queen traveled through the northern provinces. An elderly woman stopped their carriage outside a small village. Years earlier, guards might have pushed her aside. Now, Captain Rowan stepped forward politely. "What troubles you?" "The hillside above the school is shifting," she said. "It doesn't look safe." Engineers inspected it that very day. 2 days later, part of the hillside collapsed. No children were inside the school. The villagers called it a miracle. Clara simply smiled. Sometimes the future changed because people finally paid attention. As the years passed, the kingdom flourished. Trade expanded. Harvests improved. Neighboring rulers asked Alistair the secret behind such lasting peace. He always answered the same way. "I started listening to the people who believed no one would ever hear them." One quiet evening, Clara wandered into the Royal History Hall. At its center stood the broken carriage. The cracked wheel remained exactly as it had been. The frayed brake ropes rested beneath a glass case. She stood before it for a long time. Alistair found her there. "You still visit?" "Sometimes." She traced the air above the splintered wood without touching it. "I used to hate looking at it. And now? It reminds me that the future isn't something we inherit." She looked at him. "It's something we build." He slipped his hand into hers. "The kingdom doesn't resemble the one you remembered anymore." She smiled. "No. It finally feels like a place I've never seen before." Outside, children's laughter drifted through the palace gardens. The nightmare timeline had become nothing more than a fading memory. And for the first time, Clara believed it would never return. 7 years later, the Royal History Hall had become one of the most visited places in the kingdom. Foreign ambassadors toured its galleries. School children wandered through its long corridors. Young wolves training to become royal guards always stopped before the same display. At the center of the hall stood an old black carriage. Its cracked rear wheel had never been repaired. The frayed brake ropes remained exactly as they had been discovered on that winter morning. Nothing about it looked majestic. That was precisely the point. 2 small children darted between the marble columns before stopping in front of the carriage. A boy with dark hair reached toward the cracked wheel. "Father, why do we keep a broken carriage instead of something beautiful?" His younger sister nodded eagerly. "Wouldn't a golden throne be more impressive?" Alpha King Alistair Ravencrest smiled as he joined them. Queen Clara walked beside him, her fingers laced through his. The 4 of them stood quietly before the old carriage. Finally, Alistair rested one hand on the weathered wood. "Because this carriage reminds me of the day I was given a second life." The children looked up at him. "Were you hurt?" "I would have been." He glanced toward Clara. But someone refused to let that happen. Their daughter turned to her mother. "Was it really scary?" Clara laughed softly. "I was terrified." "Then why did you stop Father?" "Because sometimes being frightened doesn't mean you stay silent." She knelt so she was eye level with both children. "I was only a maid. I had no title, no power. I wasn't even supposed to speak to the king." The little boy frowned. "But you did." "I did." "Weren't you afraid people would be angry?" "Oh, they were." Everyone laughed. Even Captain Rowan, now retired but serving as the museum's honorary guide that afternoon, chuckled from across the hall. "I nearly arrested your mother," he admitted. The children stared at him in disbelief. "You did?" "I was young." Clara raised an eyebrow. "You were 50. I felt young." The room filled with warm laughter. When it faded, Alistair looked once more at the carriage. "The kingdom remembers this, as the day a conspiracy failed." He shook his head gently. "That's not what I remember." "What do you remember?" his son asked. He smiled at Clara. "I remember one ordinary woman finding the courage to whisper 3 words. He looked back at his children. "Don't get in." Everything that came afterward, he squeezed Clara's hand, was possible because someone everyone overlooked refused to remain silent. Outside, snow began falling across the palace gardens, just as it had on the day Clara first ran through the courtyard. The kingdom remembered the whisper that saved its king. History remembered the queen who proved that courage is not measured by titles, strength, or power. It is measured by the willingness to speak when silence feels safer. And every winter, as visitors paused before the broken carriage, they carried home the same lesson. Sometimes kingdoms are saved by mighty armies. Sometimes they are saved by wise rulers. But once, an entire kingdom was saved because one frightened maid reached out, grabbed a king's sleeve, and found the courage to say, "Don't get into that carriage."